Hello and welcome. My name is Carol Carter and I'm the founder and the CEO of Global Minded. I'm here with my colleague Celeste Gardner today, and along with Lisa Wyckoff and Kirsten Stewart, we welcome you to our Global Minded event 2020. We are usually in person, and because of COVID-19 this year, we're not in person. We're having a series of virtual events, of which this topic today is one of those. So if you want to share this later, you're welcome to do that. We will have this posted onto our YouTube channel. And within another couple of weeks, we'll also be doing one or two feature segments on this very topic in our newsletter. If you're not part of the newsletter, you can sign up for that at globalminded.org. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Global Minded is about creating a capable, diverse talent pipeline to get more women, people of color, underrepresented, and first generation to college into the education, employment, economic mobility, and leadership pipeline. So we do that in a number of ways, through the annual conference, through 15 college collaboratives with some of the historically Black colleges, the minority serving institutions, some of the Hispanic serving institutions. And we also have a series of Inclusive Leader Awards with people who are doing the most across 14 sectors for diversity and inclusion. So we're really glad you joined us today. It's a really difficult time in our nation. In fact, a lot of people are pausing today in solidarity for the George Floyd and the other deaths that have just continued to plague our nation. So we're going to be really mindful of that as something that's going on in case you're watching this some date in the future. But we've got COVID issues, and we've got persistent generational inequities that we're going to be dealing with today, and that can be illuminated by this equity indicators report. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nate Easley, and he applies more than 30 years of experience in educational leadership to providing strategic advice to nonprofits, college access and success organizations, foundations, and school districts. He served as the founding chief executive officer of Root Ed, and it's a 501c3 public charity focused on increasing the availability of high quality public schools in Denver through leveraged investments in education leader talent, high performing schools, and a supportive policy environment. Prior to that, he was the CEO of the Denver Scholarship Foundation, and that's where he and I met probably 5 or 6 years ago. And we're really delighted to work with so many of his students that have now graduated and are now part of Global Minded's Young Professionals group. So Nate, it's so fun to have a reason to work with you again. And I hope this launches us into many more ways we can support each other's work. So welcome. Sure. We're delighted that you're here, and thank you for leading this really critically important topic.
Thank you, Carol. I'm hearing an echo. Can you hear that? Yep, now the echo's gone. Okay. So I have the honor and opportunity to introduce our keynote and the primary panelists who introduced the panelists. Prior to moving to Denver in 2008, I worked with the Council for Opportunity in Education. And unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to work directly with Dr. Cahalan. I missed you by 3 years. I left in 2008 and you came in 2011. But I've read a lot of her work, including her indicators report that she's going to talk about today. Dr. Cahalan is director of the Pell Institute, excuse me, for the study of opportunity in higher education, and vice president for research of the Council for Opportunity in Education. She currently serves as the COE PI for an I3 grant awarded to the council in 2010, entitled Using Data to Inform College Access Programming. Dr. Cahalan joined the council in 2011 after serving as division leader for the post-secondary cross-cutting team with the Policy and Program Study Services Division of the U.S. Department of Education. Prior to that, Dr. Cahalan had been a researcher for WestEd and Mathematica for over 20 years. So her work is all over the place, and I know she's really dedicated to issues of equity. And let me, in my introduction, just say a couple things. First and foremost, these kinds of research projects and these kinds of reports help us to understand why people are in the streets. So it's hard to have a session and ignore the fact that it seems like our country's on fire right now. And a lot of folks have called me and said, well, you know, can you explain? Well, there's a lot of things that go into the fact that people are rioting. It's not only George Floyd, which was like the straw that kind of broke the camel's back, but it's 40 million people unemployed. It's inequities in our system that have been there for years and years and years and just compounded. It's living in a part of the world where you can have people who have several $billions. I think our wealthiest person is worth about upwards of $80 billion. Bloomberg is worth about $60 billion. And then you have several people who are homeless on the street. And so when you have those conditions for years and years and years, and poor education, poor healthcare, when you have a disaster like the pandemic, it just reveals and brings to the surface all these inequities. So as you think about what the panelists are talking about, use it as an opportunity to better understand why it is that people are so frustrated with this country right now, why there's so many people protesting, why there are people in the streets. This is not something that just happened with one murder. They've been murdering Black men, and I'm not trying to be flippant about this, but Black men have been murdered since they've been brought over here from Africa, since my ancestors arrived. And it wasn't unusual for that to happen in my neighborhood when I grew up. And I can tell you stories where I had personal negative experiences with police pulling me over, even after I finished my PhD. But these conditions that exist now that have led to this outrage are conditions that have lasted over years and years and accumulated over years and years. And research like this helps us to better understand it. It's important to understand it as we seek to address it. So first you have to figure out why people are so angry in order to figure out how to address it. So with that, Maggie, Dr. Cahalan, and I'd like to pass it on to you. You're on mute. There we go.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction and kind of setting the stage for our panel today. I'm Maggie Cahalan, and I'm the director of the Pell Institute, and I'm going to let our two other panelists introduce themselves. Before I begin, I'm going to give a little overview of the indicators report, but I'd just like to turn it over to Ray and also to Marisha just to say a few words about themselves and why they're here. So Ray, do you want to?
Sure.
Just.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ray Cabrera. I'm the director of the Upperbound program at the University of South Florida. I've been with our program now for 12 years, and my background includes college access and success, counseling, evaluation, leadership, and professional development. I also have the honor of serving as our regional trio VP for the Southeast region and sit on the board for the Council for Opportunity in Education. So it's my pleasure to be with you all today.
Okay. So Marissa, do you want to say a few words of introduction?
Yes. So hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Marisha Addison, and I work for the Pell Institute under Dr. Cahalan as the data analyst and the researcher. I joined in October 2019, but before then I was completing my master's in the University of Amsterdam. And then before I completed my master, I completed my Bachelor of Arts at a small school in Michigan, and I completed my sociology and my geography degree. I am also a Maryland native, so anybody from Maryland, go out there and vote today if you still have the chance. But I'm also an alumna of the TRIO program, the Talent Search program, and I'm also first generation. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Marissa. So, and I would just like to say that both Ray and Marissa are terrific, and Marissa is one of our team members for the Equity Indicators Report, and is responsible for much of compiling and making usable much of the data that's in the report. This report is a joint effort of the Pell Institute of COE, and also we work with the University of Pennsylvania, and you can see the pictures of the team that we have of co-authors, and I'm just kind of the spokesperson right now for this. So we have a website for those of you that might be interested where you can get copies of the report. And this is a repository for our past reports. We started this project in 2015. So this 2020 report that I'm gonna talk a little bit about with you is the 6th in our series. Our website also provides Excel data that you can download for each of the charts. And we also have essays and dialogue questions that we've put into the website. And soon we're going to have interactive dynamic charts for data visualization, which allows us really to get a lot more data available to people than we can put into the PDF of the report. So this project has really 3 goals, and we've pretty much had the same goals each year. The first is we wanted to provide a report where we compiled national and state statistics from an equity perspective with regard to higher education. We use census data, we use National Center for Education Statistics data, and we take a historical perspective. We track as far back as we can. Usually it's about to 1970. In some cases, it's back to 1940. And then in addition to tracking our progress, we have something we call shared solutions dialogues. And these are dialogues that address policy questions related to equity issues. And then the third thing is to support equity actions that promote a higher education system that is more equitable and is really not a zero-sum game. It's a goal that we want to support policies that allow everybody in the United States to develop their full potential and to get away from thinking that it's a zero-sum game where if one person gets ahead, another one has to fall back. So that's our overall goal. So there is a new urgency about this. One of the things that we've had in our introduction to the report every year is kind of our initial motivation for this report. And I'm going to read something from the President's Commission for Higher Education from back in 1947, around the time that I was born. So this report in the foreword says, if the ladder of educational opportunity rises high at the doors of some youth and it scarcely rises at the doors of others, while at the same time formal education is made a prerequisite to occupational and social advance, then education may become not the means of eliminating race and class distinctions, but of deepening them and solidifying them. And unfortunately, when we look at sort of the history of the last 70 years since this report, this statement was made, we see that this is, I think, become even more true than it was in 1947. The other quote that I want to read is from Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This was adopted and proclaimed by the UN General Assembly, and 166 nations have ratified this these statements, but the United States has chosen not to do so. And this says in Article 13, higher education shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of capacity by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free higher education. So a lot has been said that higher education is really at a critical crossroads. The COVID-19 pandemic has created a crisis for both institutions and learners. But this crisis has really resting on old inequalities. And I think the pandemic reveals that we can no longer turn away for these issues. It's easy to turn our heads and just turn away from them. So I guess what we've concluded is that we really need a new approach. We need a bold, ambitious plans to rebuild a system that is more equitable, is more resilient, and also is ecologically sustainable. Just to have a few more quotes. Award-winning author Arundhati Roy says, historically pandemics has forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. I think that many people have written that we really can't return to normal. We can't just have a few adjustments and return to a normal situation. We have to get to a new normal that is very different from the one that we have now. I'm just gonna have another quote. This is from Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, who's the chair of the C40 cities. And he says, COVID-19 has laid bare the systemic inequities too often found at the heart of our communities. And as we start to emerge from this crisis, we must rebuild an economy that truly works for everyone. And I would say we have to rebuild a higher education system that works for everybody. So these are just some scenes from the upper right is the memorial visit of the brother of George Floyd to the site of his death in Minneapolis. These are just some other scenes. There is one scene here of the police officer in Camden, New Jersey, marching with the protesters, which I think is what we need. We need everybody standing together or kneeling together. But in higher education, I think we have too many signs like the road signs above, like road ahead is closed, and diverting into other pathways. So I just put these in here in the beginning, but basically the statistics that I'm going to be showing you are really manifestations of exclusion, selection, competition, all through higher education. There's one picture here from 1869 of what's called Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. And this was at the time of the fight for universal suffrage. And it shows all the diverse people sitting at the same table. And I think that in higher education, we somehow have to get everybody sitting at the same table. It doesn't mean that everybody is going to be the same, but at least we have to be at a round table that includes everybody. So another issue that many people have talked about in terms of COVID-19 and the rebuilding is that we can't ignore climate issues as we rebuild. And so I just want to mention this. This isn't the focus of what we're talking about today, but I think it has to be there as we think about what plans do we have for the future. So just returning to what we have in the report, we structured this report around 6 questions, and then we also have a chapter on setting the stage. We talk about who enrolls, what type of institutions do students attend, does financial aid eliminate barriers, how do students pay for college, does bachelor's degree attainment vary by family characteristics, and how do attainment rates in the US compare with other nations? And so I'm just gonna quickly run through some slides and then we'll go to the panel. But this first slide is really, I think, presenting an unjust system. It's household income by quintiles from 1967 to 2018. And you see the growth in inequality in the US. And we see from this that 3% of the population in the lowest quintile, which is the lowest 20%, have to live on 3% of the total household income. And the next slide shows another thing that we have in our situation. We have a decline in upward mobilities. One way to measure this is the percent of children who at age 30 have a higher inflated adjusted income than their parents at age 40. And this is data from starting with 1940. And we see that at that time, 92% of children in that cohort had a higher income than their parents. We see that this has declined and it's about 50% with the most recent data. The other statistic that really, I think, explains much of what's happening now across the nation is the statistics on median wealth. And this shows, this is data in 1983 and also in 2016, We see that in 2016, among white families, the median wealth was about $146,000. We see that among Black families, it was $3,557. And among Latina families, it was $6,591. And this other statistic on the bottom here is the percent of families that have negative wealth. And this was in 2016 for Black families, this was 37%. And for Latina families, it was 33%. So we have persistent systemic inequality based on race, ethnicity, in income, and also especially in wealth. So looking at statistics, I'm just going to go through these pretty fast. We know from our high school longitudinal studies that the government does, that the NCES does, that overwhelming majority, 80% of high school students aspire to get a bachelor's degree. And we know that there has been an increase in enrollment. This is data from 1970 to 2018, and we see that by 2018, the first lowest income quartile has had their highest rate of increase, and 51% of students do enroll. This is the enrollment of 18 to 24-year-olds in higher education. But what we also see is that where they enroll is very different than where middle-class students and upper middle-class students enroll. This is data also from the high school longitudinal studies on your chance based on socioeconomic status of your parents of going to a most or highly selective college. And we see that if you were in the highest quintile, you had a chance that was 8 times higher than those in the lowest quintile. 33% of students in the highest quintile go to most or highly selective colleges, and 4% in the lowest quintile. The other thing that the indicators report tracks is data by state. And one of the things that I just want to mention is there is a widening gap in bachelor's degree attainment that is apparent in the states, and this has many consequences. This is data from 1940 to 2018, and what we can see is on the left, it's high school credential, on the right, it's the bachelor's degree, but we see this widening gap, and it's a large gap right now. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides, but the other thing that we have to think about is the fact that 50% of the students are independent students, which means in general that those are students that are over 24 or have themselves dependents. And we see that these students, making up about half of enrollment, they have the most at-risk characteristics. 80% of them are going part-time, and about 50% of them are working more than 35 hours per week. The other statistic that we track in the indicators report is the Pell Grants relative to college cost. And this chart gives this information from 1975 to 2018-19. And we see that there's a widening gap between the amount of Pell Grant coverage and the college cost. The average cost in 2018 dollars per year was about $24,000. The Pell maximum was about $6,000, and the Pell average, not everybody gets the maximum, was about $4,000. So the Pell, when it was originally thought of in Congress, it was intended to cover about 3/4 of college costs, and it was thought that students could work in the summer to cover the other costs. Now we see that it, instead of covering 3/4, it covers 25%. It never reached 3/4, but in the 70s, it did cover 2/3 of college costs. And so this chart on the right shows that in order for Pell to cover about the same amount as it did in the 1970s, it would have to be about $16,000 rather than $6,000. We also note that in the last years, state funding and support for higher education has declined. This is the support for higher education for $1,000 of personal income. We know that this isn't just related to states not wanting to support higher education, but we see that there are many other competing things in terms of state funding, notably health care has risen steadily. This is data from 1961 as a percentage of state appropriations. And we expect, given COVID-19, that this is going to change unless we have some kind of national health program. So this situation for students means that there's an extreme unmet need. By unmet need, we mean what is the need after we take into account all of the scholarships, discounts, Pell Grants? What is the amount that students can't get from these other sources? And we see that this chart on the left shows that for dependent students who are in the lowest income quartile, this amount would be 94% of their family income. This is an unbelievable statistic when you think about it. It would take 94% of that family's income. On the right, you see that the average for a dependent student per year would be $10,000, and the average for independent students would be about $16,000. This is the amount that students generally have to borrow. We know that the student debt crisis is bad for all students, but it is worse for minorities. This statistic is the amount of debt that the average bachelor's degree completer, and you can see that 70% of all bachelor's degree completers have debt, but among Black completers, for example, it's 85% have debt, and you can see that Black completers also have the highest amount of debt, 36,140 when they complete. So we know this. I'll just give a few statistics about student debt just to see how substantial it is. It's about $1.6 trillion, and there's about 45 million persons who have student debt within the United States. We know that the default rate in 2018 was actually lower than it has been previously. We know that this is going to go up a lot. In the recession of 2008, it went up to about 15%. Now it's about 11%, but we have to find a way not to sort of almost criminalize students who can't pay for their debt. This is 6-year completion rates. And when I look at these statistics, I feel like, given the statistics that I've just gone through, it's not surprising that low income and first generation students, their 6-year completion rate is about 21%. So their chance of getting a bachelor's degree is about 21% versus 66% for those that are neither low income or first generation. This is just, this is my last slide. I'll just say a little bit about the OECD data with regard to the US. This gives OECD data in 2000 and 2018, and we know in 2000, the US was second in bachelor's degree attainment for 25 to 34-year-olds. In 2018, it had fallen to 18th. And the sort of interesting thing about this, sadly interesting, is that most of the countries that are now ahead of the US were far below the US in years past, but they have found ways to widen participation among their population. And it's not that the US hasn't increased. It was 30% in 2000, now it's 39%. US is just about average in the OECD countries at the current time. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of differences among US states. If Massachusetts were a country, it would rank second. It's at 53% versus Lithuania, which is first, which is at 56%. Sadly, we have many, many states where they have not really changed very much in the last 20 years, and they're seemingly stuck at about 25%. So I did have some things that I have in the report that I would like to see happen. I'm not going to take time to go over them right now, but we'll make the slides available to anybody who wants. So now I'm going to turn it back to Nate, who's going to kind of start us off with our panel discussion.
Thanks, Maggie. This is really good information, and I think what we'd like to do with the panel is to put it into action. So after reading this report what the issues are. So I guess the question becomes, where do we go from here if we care about college attainment for first generation, low income, and students of color in this current environment? What are some things we can do to make the situation better? And I will throw it out to either panelist, either you, Ray, or you, Marisha, to kind of kick off with that one.
And Marisha, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, so the question you are asking is, what are some ways that we can help navigate first generation students during COVID-19?
Yeah, so we know what we know from the Indicators report. What do you recommend in this environment as we create a new normal?
Okay, so during COVID-19 or before COVID-19, we understood that globalization made our world smaller, and the coronavirus made everyone's world smaller. But what's really crucial to understand during this COVID-19 is that first generation and low income students got a lot smaller. So how can we help them? I think first, as a nation, I think we need to create infrastructure for everyone. Personally, I grew up in a rural town that still do not have access to broadband connectivity. So I think that in light of traditional ways that we learned and in light of post-pandemic ways that we can learn, I think we need to expand the infrastructure for everyone during COVID-19. Additionally, when thinking about the disruption that COVID-19 had to higher education, I think we need to not forget about the secondary education institutions. So change needs to happen on both levels. Personally, that's what I think. The problem will never be addressed if we continue to fail properly with only looking at the higher education institution. We need to talk about how to prepare low-income students from the beginning. And that may be something like addressing systematic problems such as zoning with zip codes, and that being a determinant of the quality of education a student experience. I personally grew up in a rural town again, and so my mother took me to another high school out of my zone that was 25 minutes away from me. And so that being said, we need to look at on how we can dismantle those systems that is already making first generation low income students have crippling and needing to catch up at a further rate. Personally, being a first generation myself, I personally, from my own experience, think that we can further equip them by exposure to different non-traditional background. I'm a geographer. A lot of people are like, what are geographers? But not only that, but encourage them to go into STEM, green job, and entrepreneurship to just pave the way for themselves. I personally didn't fit into the mode. I'm sure a lot of people that's also listening did not fit into the mode of the traditional college students, but we have the chance to create our own mode and to not just build it and create our own, but to build it for other people that come from the same background as ourselves. I think too often students are not given the same opportunity as their upper and middle class peers, and we're constantly competing in a system not designed for us. I'm going to quote a young lady. I heard this quote about a year ago when I was doing my master's in Amsterdam, and I thought it was so powerful. So I'm going to quote this real quick for everyone. When you put a monkey and a dog in front of a tree and you tell them who can be the fastest in the tree, who will win? The monkey? But they don't measure what the dog can do because they will always underestimate the dog because he can't climb the tree. I want to read that quote because I think it's so powerful that first generation and low income students need to carve their own space. And it's a shame that we have to carve our own space and build on a system that's broken, or we need to amend a system that wasn't designed for people like us. Additionally, I think that during this time, it is important to give them support, not just mental support, but increasing our teaching capacity to teach them not only how to navigate through college during this rough time, but also give them financial literacy on how to navigate once they leave the higher institution and join the workforce, because that's very important. And I'm just going to wrap up the summary of your question with some bulletin points I wrote down. I think we need a holistic way of thinking, and the indicators report is really highlighting that we tried the top-down approach. It wasn't working. Currently, we're trying the bottom-up approach, and it seems to be working, but we just need to remember to have the circle table that Dr. Cahalan mentioned in her slides, that we need to have a holistic way of thinking. I think during this time, we need to also encourage first generation and low-income students to write down their goals and dreams, to constantly remind them of what their end goal is, because during this troubling time, the mind is a tricky thing, I do believe so. So if they can just write it down and constantly remember on what they're trying to accomplish, and telling that not just to themselves, but to others who can support them, I think that would be beneficial. Thirdly, I do want to highlight that there's no right way on your journey to a higher education. You don't need to start right away. You might have to delay. You might have to switch your major. I think that's important during the COVID-19, that this never happened before, so there's no right or wrong way. And lastly, I just want to thank you for asking this question, because I think it's a really great question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marisha. So Ray, my first job out of college was an Upperbound counselor back in the day. Not in the olden days, but back in the day. And what I love to say is that Upperbound changed me as much, if not more, than it changed the students in the program. It's a very, very special program. So in many ways, TRIO and Upperbound programs have had the answers for years and years and years. So could you talk about that from the perspective of what you do through Upperbound and your experience with students, low-income students?
Definitely, and thank you for the question, Dr. Easley. When I think about the work that we do as college access professionals, we're really in the business of providing hope. And when I look at the report, right, and we talk about only 25% of tuition costs being covered, and the amount of burden that low-income families face, and then traditional, right? Like, what does that really mean today to be a traditional student? I think we're living within a time that we have to redefine what traditional means. And then when we look at some of the healthcare disparities, how can you do good if you don't feel good, right? So I think we've highlighted some very strong systematic barriers that exist for our students. So when I flip that and think about what is it that we do well, with Upperbound specifically. So we're a college prep program designed to even the playing field, that we serve low-income students, but in our program, it's to build that belief that here, anything is possible. So what does that look like? First and foremost, this becomes a family affair, that any student that comes into the program, your family and our family are now one, right? So part of the empowerment involves helping parents understand what this process of going to college is going to look like. And yes, it's going to be scary, because the price tag in the investment to go to college is going to be probably one of the bigger investments our low-income families have to make. So I'm currently in the process of completing my PhD. So I'm a PhD candidate, and I've dedicated my research to this topic. And because my hope was to provide a blueprint for first generation low income families. So part of my uncovering and part of my research looks at that. So how do we prepare students to be successful? So like, Marisha said, it has to start early. So it's important to get good grades, because you know what, now in today's society and today's economic structure, good grades equal scholarship money. Yes, there might be financial aid that you can apply to. Yes, there's scholarships out there, but there's just not enough. So the stronger academically you are, the more that's going to net you more money to go to college. Testing is huge, unfortunately, right? If I looked at how I tested it, there'd be no way I'd be on the doorstep of getting a PhD, because I was a horrible test taker. But the reality is that the better you test, the more that potentially makes you accessible to institutions that are prestigious, right? And if you're able to access these prestigious schools, then you're now part of a social network, an environment, a culture that breeds success, right? So the better you can do academically, the better you can do testing. Now I'm afforded the same space and the same environment of anyone else, economics aside. And that's where COVID is so tough, because it's hard to see that when you have to study from home. It's one thing to go to Harvard, and then another thing to go to Harvard from your couch, right? It's just a different reality that our students face. You know, and then it's, once you get to college, being able to connect students to people, right? That I think part of our success, when I think of my success or the success of my students, is because we're putting them into the hands of others that are going to guide them and fill up the gaps that they don't know. So being able to take them from an Upperbound program and place them into another program on the college level that's going to give them the same kind of attention that's needed to be successful. And we all need that. Even as a PhD candidate today, there's days that I feel like, you know what, maybe this is not for me. Maybe I can't compete with what this all means. And I have to remind myself that, no, you've put in the time, and tap into those mentors that are so important. So I think, you know, as students work towards finding that career, then it's super important to connect them to mentors who are going to be able to really pull them in and help them understand, yes, this is how you get here, and this is the pathway to it. So I think, you know, it involves a lot of human capital and a lot of social capital to get our students to where they need to go to.
Got it. We've got about 8 minutes left or so, Carol. Are there questions from the audience that we should get to?
Let's see here. Let me read you a couple of these. The first one is, are there statistics on Asian Americans, Native Americans, or other minority groups?
That one I'll throw to Maggie.
Yes, there are. It's and our report definitely has statistics on both groups. Now, it's always hard for national statistics for groups that are smaller than others, and so but we definitely have almost all the statistics that we have by race, ethnicity. Gives statistics for Asians and for Native Americans. With regard to Asians, it's a lot. There is a lot of diversity among Asians, and so most of the time there's an aggregate statistic. So there's a lot of variation, and so it's important to keep that in mind.
Let me add, I used to work with a lot of Asian students when I ran the Learning Center at UC San Diego. And I know that the statistics on the Hmong students were a lot different than the statistics on Chinese American and Korean American and Indian American. And so to lump them all into one large group called Asian, which is a very big part of the world, isn't necessarily fair to them. So if you're interested in doing research on Asians in the United States, I would encourage you, as Maggie's kind of alluded to be sure to disaggregate the data and look at specific groups. When I lived in San Diego, the students that had the lowest test scores were the Hmong students. They were lower than Native American, they were lower than African American, they were lower than Latinx students. They had the absolute lowest test scores. And you wouldn't know that if you just looked at aggregate data. Next question.
So then we have one comment and then a question. Adrian Rosado says, great points. To quote Ray, we are in the business of providing hope. Powerful. Thank you. Next question is, how about solutions for student success for individual college programs?
If you guys don't feel comfortable taking it, I'm happy to jump in.
Jump in.
Okay. So one of my roles, I have several hats. One of them is president of the National College Attainment Network. And we work with lots of different programs, including TRIO programs. It's really important that programs try to get off, if they're not already at the center of what the institution's mission is, to use this opportunity to become part of the center, to become crucial to the institution's mission. For many years, programs like Upperbound and Talent Search and Student Support Services and McNair and Gear Up, and I can keep going, have done an amazing job of working with first-generation low-income students and have developed a particular expertise and respect in working with these families. but oftentimes they'll be boutique and put on the edge of the campus. When you have millions and millions of unemployed people and the likelihood of gaps growing and more low-income families trying to seek out higher ed, we cannot be at the edge of campus anymore. We need to be central to what the campus does. So I'll give you a great example of that. I started off as an Upward Bound counselor at Colorado State University a few years ago, let's say sometime in the 80s. And the director that hired me became the assistant vice president for persistence and retention. And I now serve on the board of governors for Colorado State. And so not only do I happen to know that our largest campus, Colorado State Fort Collins, has a real particular interest and great services for low-income students, but I also happen to know that the reason that Colorado State is so good with low-income students is because of Paul Thayer and because of the Upward Bound program and because of this philosophy that low-income first generation and kids of color are going to be at the center of what we do at this institution and not some afterthought. So this is the time to speak up as a program and to meet with your presidents and let them know, if they don't already know, what you mean to the communities that surround these campuses.
It's a
Next
really
question.
good point. I think that whole thing, Nate, of these students being at the place of power, that's how they find their voice. That's how they're going to be more powerful with that degree. And those are circles of power and places at the table where they need to be right now. So next person says, thank you for the presentation and for taking the time. Ultimately, it seems that accessibility is the main challenge. To change this, it seems programs like Pell Grants or funding from federal or state would be the main solution. How do we change that? Do we restructure the budgets or tax policies, or what else can be done?
Well, again, I'm going to jump in because I feel really strongly. It is time for people to get in touch with their members of Congress and let them hear that message. We live in a democracy. I was just on a call with former Secretary of Education John King last week, and I said, why is higher ed treated like the Rodney Dangerfield of industry? In other words, why are we always an afterthought? For those who are not old enough to know who Rodney Dangerfield was, his favorite line was, "I get no respect." And he said, because higher ed only speaks for itself, and there aren't others, major players, who are speaking for higher ed, and that higher ed needs to get business to speak up and say, look, I'm the CEO of a Fortune 500, and without the university producing diverse graduates, I'm not going to have the kind of employees I need to be successful. We need to not only give relief to the airline industry at $25 billion, but we need to go up on the $14 billion that was given to all of higher ed, because if you look at the importance of that to the future of the United States, $14 billion is just a drop in the bucket. We need to invest a lot more in terms of emergency relief in higher ed than we do, with all due respect, to our airline industries.
Yeah.
So Congress has to hear from us now about what our priorities are.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here, like, because we've been talking about this. We really do need to restore Pell, because right now we keep hearing we don't have the resources, but we have the resources. As Martin Luther King said, it's a matter of will. That we could have put Pell up to whatever it would cost, which is about $78 billion per year, to make it $16,000 maximum. And that is less than the increases we give to defense every year. I mean, I think students have a right. They have a right to an education, and right now, I think that right is not being observed at all. I think it's.
Well, I agree. And I think the other big message to businesses is there's no way they can get a diverse talent pipeline, which they say they want and need, when 11% of these students pre-COVID were graduating. And you know that number is being really blown apart with COVID. So, you know, if 10 million Pell eligible were starting college last year and 1 million were expected to graduate in 4 to 6 years, okay, of that 1 million, what are we looking at now and how can we support those students and those that come after them? And that is our diverse talent pipeline right there. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
And it's not going to change unless we change the finances of higher ed.
Here,
And the
here.
other thing we need to do is equalize the institutions in terms of we need to intentionally make institutions equal in terms of the quality of the education and the status of the institutions. I think the ranking and rating of institutions is really I think in the end it creates a situation where we have kind of monocultures of students at different academic and financial levels. And I think that we need diversity. We're not going to have, you know, any ecosystem that is not diverse is not going to function for very long. It's not sustainable. So I feel like we need to really reduce the stratification of the institutions if we're going to have a more equal system.
I agree. And I think another part of that is also foundations and funders, and they need more amazing students like Marisha at the table while she's still in college to help inform what they're actually funding. And they can't do that in a vacuum. And that's why these connections are so critical, not just for Marisha to learn how they work, but they need to learn how she works and what her needs are. And these are bridges that we have to be building across all the different hidden highways that go on out there in terms of, how people really get to financial freedom and how we can have millions of these deserving students get there. So, well, you guys did an amazing job. And I will say, I know everyone at this really critical time in our history is saying, what can we do? And we hope everyone's registered to vote, everyone's counted in the census, everyone's writing their congressman, their senator, as Nate suggested. And we hope that you will share this session today with like 10 other critical people who could do something with this, because you all who came today, you have really important networks. So let's get this word out, and we'll be doing a segment of follow-up in the next couple of weeks through our newsletter that you can also share. But this is going to take a gigantic movement of awareness to people who are in businesses and at these foundations and in these government offices. And that's communication on a lot of different levels that we need to communicate. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Just thank you for representing your generation so beautifully today. And to all of you who are just out there leading this charge. So we look forward to continuing to support your work. And we hope that the rest of you will join us later this week and be part of our The Future of Work is Diverse and Inclusive, all of our main stage events next week for Global Minded. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone.
Bye everyone.